Since it was introduced in 2020, there has been nothing but a cloud of confusion surrounding DoD contractors. From its soon-to-be mandated requirements to its headline-grabbing controversies, many contractors are left with no choice but to bombard the CMMC-AB with questions during their monthly town hall meetings. The only problem is CMMC-AB doesn't have enough resources to answer everything, and that's where we come in. Welcome to CMMC Unacknowledged, where we answer the unanswered questions that were asked during the monthly CMMC-AB town hall meetings. My name is Todd Stanton. I'm the Regional Sales Manager for all things CMMC at Etactics. And as always, I'm joined by Ty Wittenberg. Ty is the Senior Information Assurance Manager at Rain Associates. Welcome, Ty.
Hey, thanks, Todd. Thanks for having me back.
So our question for this episode is, how can the Accreditation Board be setting up training? In this case, we're talking about the Certified CMMC Professional Training when DoD rulemaking really hasn't even happened yet.
Yeah, that's a great one, Todd, right? Because that's sort of a speculative game around curriculum. That's a really good, tough question for me to answer. Let me think about that for a second. How can the AB be setting up training when DoD rulemaking hasn't occurred yet? Let me base it off of this. There is a current foundation around the federal acquisition regulation, around the safeguards that are involved there. So, I mean, when you think of 52.204.201 around the basic safeguards, not much of that has changed. So you can put a curriculum around that. You can put a curriculum around executive orders that have talked about initiatives that need to happen in the space. So I think it's a safe place to say that even though the DoD hasn't set the exact rules around the maturity levels, they have set things in place around the federal acquisition regulation and around the DFARS that don't change. And to be honest with you, DFARS 252.204, -712 around the compliance, that a lot of organizations under self-assessment have been saying they're doing these things and not fully understanding the complexity. And right. So I think helping train the folks that are going to get folks prepared to honestly answer that question, yes or no, is an easy thing. And then cybersecurity is always ever changing. And so through executive orders that come out, through initiatives that the armed forces are implementing, I think it'll be clear from the Pentagon on down to the CMMC that they can create some future training that will will definitely help guide the organization seeking certification, but more importantly, the folks helping assess that for those folks to achieve those goals.
I spoke to a provisional assessor the other day. He's actually now a provisional instructor, and I think I asked the same question to him, and I think a lot of it goes back to this whole provisional model, right? The need to start the framework that was approved by DoD, right? They published the CMMC guide and wrote out maturity levels 1 through 3. But I think that some of the training that they're providing today, that according to him, matches what the provisional instructor and provisional assessor training talked about on the items that we still don't have clarity, like the scoping guide and the actual assessment process. So they're really just using what was drafted 2 years ago and approved by DoD then to train the CCP today, in lieu of having any guidance really come out from DoD on some of those topics that they know we expect to get clarity on in the near term. So I guess when it comes to the CCP training, I would imagine if there is a ruling that comes out by DoD that changes the scoping guide or the assessment process, that those revisions would be communicated to the people that took the CCP classes. Now, I'll remind you that they're not going to conduct the examinations on these CCPs until February. So they have bought themselves, 4 months in terms of giving some leeway to DoD to issue some final documentation around scoping and the assessment process before they start testing, whether or not these classes for CCP have really relayed all the learning objectives that they were meant to. And so that leads me to my next question. Do you expect the accreditation board to start to publish some of this body of knowledge that's containing the CCP training, the learning objectives? Do you think that they'll make that available for public consumption?
That's a great question. The training itself, like even the stuff that you and I participated in for the registered provider, hasn't necessarily been public. The public information really has to do with the DFARS and with your ability to stitch together the Defense Acquisition, Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, NIST 800-53 assessments, as well as the Federal Acquisition Regulation. So I'm not really sure there how to answer that question because when I initially started this journey, my journey started through looking at the MEP and then looking at what I was already doing with NIST, which is the foundational stuff for most government work. But then more importantly, looking at FedRAMP and things like that as well too. So there were a couple models that are out there. The publicly portion of that training, I don't know if that will be public record. That'll be hard to say. That'll be dependent upon what the executive branch releases under their expectations under acquisition and supplemental around safeguarding, data. So I guess I would say keep your eyes out for and take a look at, great news sources, to help you with that. FedScoop is one that I look at pretty regularly to see what's going on out there around the DoD, around modernization, around the workforce, around policy, and any other news sources out there to help you keep a finger on the pulse of what's going out there. I mean, heck, for that matter, even take a look at bills that are looking to be floated in the House and in the Senate, specifically to cyber security, to keep your finger on the pulse.
Okay. And my last question then about the training. In the last town hall, Kyle Gingrich, the Vice President of Training and Development, discussed that CCP training isn't there to make you a cybersecurity expert. I guess the focus is really on the assessment process and the CMMC model. So my question to you, what training or certifications do you think would be most relevant for someone looking to either implement these controls or become an assessor and evaluate, the effectiveness of controls that have been put in place?
Yeah. So, I sat in on that as well too. There's this thought process sometimes where you can sit through a CompTIA class or sit through a CISSP class, and then all of a sudden you can, be the skilled operator in that particular space. I would say if folks are currently doing on-the-job training around audit and in these security roles around network architecture and infrastructure, understanding policy and procedure, those things are important. If you're already operating in that space and you're looking for a certified information security auditor or certified information security manager, usually when you can pass those particular exams, you have some hands-on training as well as concept and then actual that helps you to kind of navigate through these waters. Doing the work every day as a information security risk, a governance risk and compliance person on my particular end, not all my time is spent fully on the DoD. I've spent a lot of time, doing HIPAA risk assessments, participating as a provider on SOC 1, SOC 2, even though you need to be a CPA in order to sign off on those. I also do some things with our, because we're a cybersecurity division in a accounting firm. So I do the IT audit. And then, as we're even speaking of that, I'm studying for my CISA and my CISSP to take those here in January. And then hopefully roll right from into that into the the CCP program and take that test as well too. So I guess there has to be some on the job training, and some experiential things that have allowed you to go in and assess organizations, that will make it much more beneficial for you to pass this test quicker versus later. Like if you're fresh out of college and you've never participated in an audit, you've never stood up a network or anything like that, it might be hard for you to think that you're just going to do CCP training and then roll right into being an assessor. As I guess, so there's no clear thing that says you have to have a college degree or you have to have these certifications, but I think experience is really at the heart of a lot of that. If you haven't been involved in any type of IT audit or assessment before, you can't just get it from reading, right? Especially if you're going to go on site and provide, actual physical evidentiary observation of somebody doing it. You have to have, walk a mile in my shoes. You've had to have been able to do that as well too.
And I guess as a follow-up to that, I've read that 65% roughly of the control requirements within CMMC are non-technical, right? Their policies, their plans, their procedures and processes. So do any of those certifications that you talked about, CISA, CISM, CISSP, do any of those relate better to the non-technical aspects of CMMC?
Yeah, CISA really talks about policy and procedures as well. I mean, CISSP does as well too. CISSP is more high-level thinking around it. So there's the blocking and tackling that goes into that. Sure, you can set up a config file for a switch or a firewall, but why are you doing that? Understanding the why behind it is more important, or is really important as well too. More in that particular case, around those 65% you were talking about. So I think you have to understand why the tool is doing what it's doing, and why the policy that's written for it. How is the tool actually implementing that? So there's a real delicate balance. You have to be able to have the mindset to know how to ask the right questions, know how the tool works, and more importantly, know how the policy matches up with the tool. Because, all of us, and this as well as anybody, you work in an organization that uses Google Workplace, and you guys are highly involved in the HIPAA field, and I know for a fact that you guys are highly tuned on your HIPAA rules in there to make sure that you're in compliance with HIPAA in your Google Workplace setup. So it's clearly understanding, knowing the policy, knowing the rule, knowing how the tool matches up with what the expectations of that compliance rule are and implementing it, and then the policy that matches it. So yeah, I would say your CISA, your CISM, or a CISSP is a pretty high level for it. But if you have that, and in some cases, even if you have a Security Plus, I feel like you're in a good place with understanding how the tools work with the policy.
Perfect. Well, as always, very thorough answer, and it's nice to hear from somebody that has actually looked at this stuff to understand where people who are looking to get in this field could start in terms of paths for certification. So we appreciate your responses on that. Thank you, Todd.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right, our question for this episode is there a contact within CMMC that can be helpful if RPOs have questions or want clarification on specific controls?
I don't know if there's a direct contact. I will tell you that when I've gone to support in the CMMC and sent an email, they've been very good about responding back and giving resources or tools or pointing where you need to go. So if you're uncertain, support at CMMC.AB or CMMC-AB.org is probably your quickest resource. But more importantly, there's lots of folks out there that have groups that they form, whether it be local or not. Sometimes I like to think of the automobile industry that does something called a 20 group. I think where we all could be more beneficial as RPOs is that particular sharing of information around for help and questions, sort of like the CMMC summit that we held at Walsh. Mm-hmm. Being agnostic and taking on the partnership and sharing of information and understanding. I don't think that takes anything away from an organization's intellectual property, and might provide you with a much faster response than trying to get it just purely through support.
I think the way that they've designed the ecosystem, the RP training was kind of basic, and here's the model and here's the objective of what we're trying to accomplish. Now we're coming out with the CCP, which is getting a little more granular into the practices and the processes and the training around that. So I think, if you were to ask some specific questions to the CMMC-AB, they probably point you to an LTP, right? A licensed training partner that has that content that, their job in the ecosystem is to provide that training. And I think that, the incentive would be take a CCP class if you really want to dig a little deeper on these controls. Yeah. And I'm hearing that these classes are all either in person or virtual right now, which gives you the opportunity to ask questions of your instructor if you're unclear on something. And these are the people that have, the pedigree and the background, the experience that they've probably dealt with these controls for years, and they could probably answer the questions that the RPOs have at this point, right?
Yeah, and I apologize that I left that out. I didn't even the your license training folks or your LTPs are going to be a great resource. Exactly.
But they're not free, right?
They are not free. That is correct.
So who do you turn to would be my next question. If you had a question on the CMMC model, who would you go to? Is it somebody that you know in the industry, or is it a resource that you found to be helpful online? Where do you turn to when you're looking for an answer?
So for me, because I've dealt so heavily with NIST 853 and the cybersecurity framework, just from a free resource, I turn to the NIST site, right? But then I have a network of partners out there that I can reach out to that are in the CMMC ecosystem and then are outside of it. And we've got a little bit of depth in my organization that allows me to partner, as I'm working towards my CISSP, like I shared earlier. My principal, my leader, Paul Hugenberg, is a CISSP and also a registered practitioner. So, when he and I talk about a lot of things, he is a good sounding board and resource, and will challenge me to reach out to the folks that we know also in the marketplace, or shoot that email to the support group. But more importantly, now that we have this particular piece of information around the LTPs, and to your point, I know some folks that are going through that as well too, and I could partner with them as well, just to get their insight.
Okay, and you mentioned NIST 853. I was going to ask you, have you ever traced back controls from CMMC to NIST 800-171 or 853, or even I've seen references to ISO 27001. And do you find that some of those other frameworks offer better guidance than what's been provided within the CMMC assessment guides?
So if you want to get down and dirty and gritty, everything maps back to NIST. The 800-171 is really part of those 14 families around access control, around communications, around media, around physical security, just to give a couple examples. But then to get even more granular in those access families, you have different levels within the 800-171 that are tied to 853. And more importantly, are tied to your basic safeguards. So it's is the right word, amalgamation, a conglomerate? No, conglomerates of companies, but it is a book of resources around your federal acquisition regulations, your DFARS, and your NIST that really kind of drive the CMMC model and help you. And if you are a NIST practitioner, you're in a good place. ISO 27001 really kind of speaks to the standards. It's another good resource, but it's not as readily available. It goes back to your point about if you have questions and another resource with the LTPs, you have to pay for it, right? So
Okay.
if you're an organization that is looking to try to minimize some of your costs, go into your NIST 853 revision 4, and I know there's a test for revision 5 out there, but those are good resources for you.
Okay, perfect. Well, I think that's great insight. I haven't had the time to start digging into some of the previous frameworks, but I have seen them referenced a lot. So certainly appreciate that insight. And I think that would be helpful for somebody looking for more guidance to go back to see when these controls were initially written and what corresponding instructions were provided back on some of those older documents.
Yeah, most definitely. Like the 800-171 self-assessment, just to piggyback and on that, a lot of it, ties back into your 853 controls under each particular level, right? So like if you go through access management, like 3.1, it's like 3.11 to 3.19 if I'm 1.19 if I'm not mistaken. So I mean, there is a ton of stuff that ties back to the different NIST 853 controls that can help you. If you wanted to cross match that framework to another format, you particularly could if you're not a NIST shop, but I'm a NIST guy, so it makes it clearly easier for me to say, okay, this is why this makes sense.
So I understand there's 800-171, but then there's also 800-171A. Do you prefer one versus the other?
So when I'm doing assessments, I'm working off of the A, which has that whole question, particularly around system security plan in there, and then also talks about incident response. But the self-assessment is the self-assessment, right? That's what everybody's using right now to put in the supplier risk score through the procurement integration portal. It is a framework to ask the questions, but to confirm that you're doing these particular things, if you're assessing yourself on your own or if you're hiring an RPO to help you, your backbone or your foundation is really your 853 revision 4 around those questions in the 800-171 for the 110 controls.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you providing some clarity on that and answer some questions that I had and that we've seen on some of the town hall meetings. So thank you again for your time, Ty.
Yeah, you are welcome.